The next Sunday, Johnny and the 3 children set out for Canarsie. Francie was 11 years old, Neely 10, and little Tilly well past 3. Johnny wore his tuxedo and derby and a fresh collar and dicky. Francie and Neely wore their everyday clothes. Little Tilly's mother, in honour of the day, had dressed her up in a cheap but fancy lace dress trimmed with a dark pink ribbon. On the trolley ride out, they sat in the front seat and Johnny made friends with the motorman and they talked politics. They got off at the last stop, which was Canarsie, and found their way to a little wharf on which was a tiny shack. A couple of waterlogged rowboats bobbed up and down on the frayed ropes which held them to the wharf. A sign over the shack read, "Fishing tackle and boats for rent." Underneath was a bigger sign which said, "Fresh fish to take home for sale here." Johnny negotiated with the man and, as was his way, made a friend of him. The man invited him into the shack for an eye-opener, saying that he himself only used the stuff for a nightcap. While Johnny was inside getting his eyes opened, Neely and Francie pondered how a nightcap could also be an eye-opener. Little Tilly stood there in her lace dress and said nothing. Johnny came out with a fishing pole and a rusty tin can filled with worms in mud. The friendly man untied the rope from the least sorry of the rowboats, put the rope in Johnny's hand, wished him luck, and went back to his shack. Johnny put the fishing stuff into the bottom of the boat and helped the children in. Then he crouched on the wharf, the bit of rope in his hand, and gave instructions about boats. "There is always a wrong and a right way to get on a boat," said Johnny, who had never been on any boat except an excursion boat once. "The right way is to give the boat a shove and then jump in it before it drifts out to sea, like this." He straightened up, pushed the boat from him, leaped, and fell into the water. The petrified children stared at him. A second before, Papa had been standing on the dock above them. Now he was below them in the water. The water came to his neck, and his small waxed moustache and derby hat were in the clear. His derby was still straight on his forehead. Johnny, as surprised as the children, stared at them a moment before he said, "Don't any of you damn kids dare to laugh." He climbed into the boat, almost upsetting it. They didn't dare laugh aloud, but Francie laughed so hard inside that her ribs hurt. Neely was afraid to look at his sister. He knew that if their eyes met, he'd burst out laughing. Little Tilly said nothing. Johnny's collar and dicky were a sodden, paperish mess. He stripped them off and threw them overboard. He rowed out to sea waveringly, but with silent dignity. When he came to what he thought was a likely spot, he announced that they were going to drop anchor. The children were disappointed when they discovered that the romantic phrase simply meant that you threw a lump of iron attached to a rope overboard. Horrified, they watched Papa squeamishly impale a muddy worm on the hook. The fishing started. It consisted in baiting the hook, casting it dramatically, waiting a while, pulling it up, minus worm and fish, and starting the whole thing over again. The sun grew bright and hot. Johnny's tuxedo dried to a stiff, wrinkled, greenish outfit. The children started to get a whopping case of sunburn. After what seemed hours, Papa announced to their intense relief and happiness that it was time to eat. He wound up the tackle, put it away, pulled up the anchor and made for the wharf. The boat seemed to go in a circle which made the wharf get further away. Finally, they made shore a few hundred yards further down. Johnny tied up the boat, told the children to wait in it, and went ashore. He said he was going to treat them to a nice lunch. He came back after a while, walking sideways, carrying hot dogs, huckleberry pie, and strawberry pop. They sat in the rocking boat tied to the rotting wharf, looked down into the slimy green water that smelled of decaying fish, and ate. Johnny had had a few drinks ashore, which made him sorry that he had hollered at the kids. He told them they could laugh at his falling into the water if they wanted to, but somehow they couldn't bring up a laugh. The time was past for that. Papa was very cheerful, Francie thought. "This is the life," he said, "away from the maddening crowd. "Ah, there's nothing like going down to the sea in a ship. We're getting away from it all," he ended up cryptically. After their amazing lunch, Johnny rowed them out to sea again. Perspiration poured down from under his derby, and the wax in the points of his moustache melted, causing the neat adornment to change into disorganised hair on his upper lip. He felt fine. He sang lustily as he rowed. Sailing, sailing, over the bounding main. He rowed and kept going around in a circle and never did get out to sea. Eventually, his hands got so blistered that he didn't feel like rowing anymore. Dramatically, he announced that he was going to pull for the shore. He pulled and finally made it by rowing in smaller and smaller circles and making the circles come near the wharf. He never noticed that the 3 children were pea green in the spots where they were not beet red from the sunburn. If he had only known it, the hot dogs, huckleberry pie, strawberry pop and worms squirming on the hook weren't doing them much good. At the wharf, he leaped to the dock and the children followed his example. All made it excepting Tilly, who fell into the water. Johnny threw himself flat on the dock, reached in and fished her out. Little Tilly stood there, her lace dress wet and ruined, but she said nothing. Although it was a broiling hot day, Johnny peeled off his tuxedo jacket, knelt down and wrapped it around the child. The arms dragged in the sand. Then Johnny took her up in his arms and strode up and down the dock, patting her back soothingly and singing her a lullaby. Little Tilly didn't understand a thing of all that happened that day. She didn't understand why she had been put into a boat, why she had fallen into the water, or why the man was making such a fuss over her. She said nothing. When Johnny felt that she was comforted, he set her down and went into the shack, where he had either an eye-opener or a nightcap. He bought 3 flounders from the man for a quarter. He came out with the wet fish wrapped in a newspaper. He told his children that he had promised to bring home some fresh-caught fish to Mama. "The principal thing," said Papa, "is that I am bringing home fish that were caught at Canarsie. It makes no difference who caught them. The point is that we went fishing and we're bringing home fish." His children knew that he wanted Mama to think he caught the fish. Papa didn't ask them to lie. He just asked them not to be too fussy about the truth. The children understood. They boarded one of those trolley cars that had 2 long benches facing each other. They made a queer row. First there was Johnny in green wrinkled salt-stiff pants, an undershirt full of big holes, a derby hat and a disorderly moustache. Next came little Tilly, swallowed up in his coat, with salt water dripping from under it and forming a brackish pool on the floor. Francie and Neely came next. Their faces were brick red and they sat very rigid, trying not to be sick. People got on the car, sat across from them and stared curiously. Johnny sat upright, the fish in his lap, trying not to think of the holes in his exposed undershirt. He looked over the heads of the passengers, pretending to study an ex-lax advertisement. More people got on. The car got crowded, but no one would sit next to them. Finally, one of the fish worked its way out of the sodden newspaper and fell on the floor where it lay slimily in the dust. It was too much for little Tilly. She looked into the fish's glazed eye, said nothing, but vomited silently and thoroughly all over Johnny's tuxedo jacket. Francie and Neely, as if waiting for that cue, also threw up. Johnny sat there with 2 exposed fish in his lap, one at his feet, and kept staring at the ad. He didn't know what else to do. When the grisly trip was ended, Johnny took Tilly home, feeling that his was the responsibility of explaining. The mother never gave him a chance to explain. She screamed when she saw her dripping, befouled child. She snatched the coat off, threw it into Johnny's face, and called him a Jack the Ripper. Johnny tried and tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. Little Tilly said nothing. Finally, Johnny got a word in edgewise. "Lady, I think your little girl has lost her speech." Whereupon the mother went into hysterics. You did it, she screamed at Johnny. "Can't you make her say something?" The mother grabbed the child and shook her and shook her. "Speak," she screamed. "Say something." Finally, little Tilly opened her mouth, smiled happily, and said, "Thanks." Katie gave Johnny a tongue lashing and said that he wasn't fit to have children. The children in question were alternating between the chills and hot flashes of a bad case of sunburn. Katie nearly cried when she saw the ruin of Johnny's only suit. It would cost $1 to get it cleaned, steamed and pressed, and she knew it would never be the same again. As for the fish, they were found to be in an advanced state of decay and had to be thrown into the garbage can. The children went to bed. Between chills and fever and bouts of nausea, they buried their heads under the covers and laughed silently and bed-shakingly at the remembrance of Papa standing in the water. Johnny sat at the kitchen window until far into the night, trying to figure out why everything had been so wrong. He had sung many a song about ships and going down to the sea in them with a heave-ho and a heave-to. He wondered why it hadn't turned out the way it said in songs. The children should have returned exhilarated and with a deep and abiding love for the sea, and he should have returned with a fine mess of fish. Why, oh why hadn't it turned out the way it did in a song? Why did there have to be his blistered hands and his spoiled suit and sunburn and rotting fish and nausea? Why didn't little Tilly's mother understand the intention and overlook the result? He couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure it out. The songs of the sea had betrayed him.